Donc nous allons écouter 4 exposés et nous devrons quitter cette salle à 11 heures pour permettre à Robert Lepage et ses comédiens de se préparer à nous présenter une prestation à 16 heures dans cette même salle. Donc, à 11 heures, nous allons sortir par cette porte et si vous souhaitez discuter avec les participants, ce sera possible. Nous prendrons le temps qu'il faut dans le foyer où il y a des chaises qui nous attendent et nous pourrons discuter ensemble de 11 heures à midi, par exemple. Et je rappelle aussi qu'à 12h30, justement au foyer, il y a une rencontre pour la préparation d'un livre sur la critique de théâtre. Alors, tout le monde est invité à se joindre à cette discussion préparatoire. Alors, je vous présente brièvement mes invités, Ludovic Fouquet, Don Rubin, Chantal Hébert et Karen Fricker. C'est Ludovic Fouquet qui va commencer. Alors, Ludovic Fouquet est titulaire d'un doctorat sur la pratique de Robert Lepage et sa relation aux technologies.
Alors donc, je vais essayer de concentrer un petit peu mon intervention qui était prévue un peu plus longue et je voulais vous montrer notamment des images sur le travail de Robert Lepage, de langage technologique de l'image autour notamment de la photographie, du cinéma et des environnements virtuels. Donc ça, c'est vraiment dès 1979, la date de sortie du conservatoire de Lepage. Tout de suite, on remarque son travail avec ce fort potentiel du visuel. C'est vraiment ce visuel qui, par une grande simplicité et une grande puissance, qui va marquer les premiers spectateurs de Lepage qui ont l'impression de voir du cinéma au théâtre. Je voudrais donc m'intéresser à quelques aspects de ce travail de Lepage en m'intéressant d'abord, surtout sur le dispositif qui va évoluer entre la boîte et l'écran et qui serait au service d'un conteur, d'un acteur qui serait avant tout un conteur. En effet, si Lepage est souvent appelé magicien des images, il se revendique avant tout comme un raconteur d'histoires. Et je voudrais voir un petit peu assez vite là comment, dans ce dispositif entre boîte et écran, le récit et la narration fonctionnent. Donc, les premières mises en scène entre 79 et 85 sont des mises en scène qui ne s'appuient pas vraiment sur une scénographie précise. C'est plutôt une période de formation pendant laquelle on va développer un théâtre de bout de ficelle. Je vois que ça avance tout seul. Voilà. Un théâtre de bout de ficelle, un théâtre qui va être avant tout un théâtre de l'objet, qui va s'amuser de tout. Par exemple, dans Circulation, on va utiliser les flycases, donc les caisses de transport du matériel de théâtre, pour créer les différents éléments, les différents espaces dont on a besoin, aussi bien des lits que des boîtes diverses. Et donc, l'objet, effectivement, ça va être aussi quelque chose quand même, ce travail avec l'objet et l'inspiration de l'objet qui, à l'époque, était quand même assez novateur au Québec. On pense par exemple dans Vinci, le fameux mètre à mesurer qui est utilisé pour fabriquer toutes sortes d'éléments qu'évoque Lepage dans cette pièce. Il y a une collaboration importante dans ces années 80, c'est le travail avec les marionnettes. En effet, Lepage, entre 1980 et 85, va collaborer avec les marionnettes du Grand Théâtre de Québec. Et cette collaboration est très importante parce qu'elle va vraiment conditionner toute la pensée du théâtre ensuite, aussi bien le dispositif, le travail avec l'acteur et le rapport à l'objet. Donc il va être metteur en scène pour cette compagnie de marionnettes pour 4 spectacles et il va être lui-même comédien manipulateur dans À vol d'oiseau en 1983. Lepage par la suite fera appel dans 4 spectacles à des marionnettes, notamment ici dans les 7 branches de la rivière Ota. 4 spectacles, donc c'est La face cachée de la lune, Appassionata et Coriolan dans le désordre. Il les évoque aussi dans Elseneur pour une petite scène dans La souricière. Et puis surtout, le fait de travailler avec des marionnettes va vraiment se retrouver dans tout son travail d'objet par la suite. Donc ici, dans La face cachée de la lune, Lepage manipulant une marionnette, mais aussi on va retrouver énormément d'objets de toutes dimensions dans différents spectacles qui sont pensés et manipulés comme des objets. Par exemple, ici, dans la face cachée de la Lune, l'assemblage des bouteilles qui va progressivement dessiner la fusée qui s'envole.
Et je vais d'abord commencer par quelques mots de Robert Lepage qui dit « Le théâtre, c'est l'art de la transformation et le spectateur y vient pour voir autrement ». Je pense que ces quelques mots résument la vision du théâtre de Robert Lepage, mais elles résument aussi l'enjeu de son écriture scénique et de son théâtre de l'image. Alors, quelques mots d'abord de cette écriture scénique. C'est une écriture, le mot le dit, le qualificatif le dit, qui se fait d'abord directement dans l'espace scénique. C'est une écriture qui est faite d'assemblage d'éléments qui sont paroles, musique, objets, Ludovic Fouquet l'a dit, textes, mouvements, appareils technologiques de toutes sortes, boîtes, écrans, Fouquet en a parlé. Bref, d'éléments qui sont disparates, qui sont hétérogènes et qui vont être exploitables tout au long du processus de création. Ils sont exploités par un travail intuitif, par un travail associatif qui peut relever de ce qu'on peut appeler le bricolage. Le terme ici n'a rien de péjoratif, il est employé tout simplement au sens anthropologique du terme, c'est-à-dire qu'il renvoie à une façon de travailler qui est improvisée à partir des éléments et des circonstances, et j'ajouterais, en ce qui concerne Lepage, des personnes avec lesquelles il travaille et des contingences du moment. Donc, ce terme bricolage me permet de souligner l'aptitude de l'artiste à détourner les objets de leur système de référence premier, les objets, les éléments, etc., de leur système de référence premier, et donc, par conséquent, de les transformer. Et là, on a plusieurs exemples de ces transformations, des figures, des monuments, des événements culturels ou historiques qu'il convoque. Pensons à Vinci, à Andersen, à la cathédrale de Florence, à l'exposition universelle de Paris, etc. Je pourrais en nommer plusieurs. Je vais éviter ici, moi, d'aller dans les exemples. Ludovic en a donné quelques-uns, des exemples visuels. Je vais plutôt m'arrêter à une vision globale, générale de la pensée qu'on peut avoir, qu'on peut développer sur son théâtre. Donc, l'écriture scénique, et le jeu des transformations qui résultent de cette écriture scénique-là, permet donc la création de la matière ou du texte spectaculaire qui se fait au fil du processus de création et qui va se déployer directement sur la scène. C'est donc une écriture polysémique, une écriture polyphonique qui n'a rien à voir avec l'impérialisme du texte littéraire et qui cherche à se détacher, ça je pense que c'est important, de tout modèle préétabli, de toute forme fixe et qui a surtout permis à la dimension visuelle de refaire surface, dimension visuelle qui est au fondement de l'art théâtral.
My interest lies primarily in what happens once Lepage's work makes contact with audiences. I'm interested in the meanings Lepage's productions make in the various cultures in which they are presented. And a basic principle of my approach is that we must identify Lepage first and foremost as a Quebecois artist, and his work is connected to and speaking of his native culture. Now, I'm not saying that this is a particularly radical idea or one that's unique to Lepage. All artists, all people come from somewhere. But I think that it's important to start by naming Lepage as Quebecois because his international success and because the international multicultural flavor of his work often tempts critics and viewers to stress its globalized qualities and to celebrate him for being an artist for a postmodern, post-national age. Well, in fact, the way that I look at this is through the lens of globalization theory, which tells us that in the age of globalization, the local is not disappearing, but the local is being inserted into new international and global contexts in different and exciting ways. The local's not being dissolved, but it provides a recontextualization. I think that's an important lens by which to view Lepage's work, and I'm particularly interested at the moment in looking at how he is adapting his creative processes, and it appears his expectations, in order to present work that is going to always already be received in multinational contexts. Now, one of the key ways, as I see it, in which Lepage's work manifests its Quebec roots is its ongoing interest in and affiliation to both of Quebec's cultural poles. That would be Europe and North America, particularly the United States. Lepage is a Francophone and a Quebec nationalist whose work uses cultural codes which are quite specific to Francophone Canada, Francophone Quebec. At the same time, however, American locations, artists, and themes very often feature in his work, and he has consistently shown a marked sympathy for the federal Canadian project. Now, while my chosen topic today here is the European side of Lepage's work, it is striking how often North American and European locations, characters, and themes are mixed in his work, and in fact how artificial it might be to try and differentiate one from the other. And I might suggest that it is that mixing of North American and European that makes his work uniquely Quebecois. That being said, what I'm interested in looking at today, given the context, is the ways in which Lepage has represented Europe in his work and used it as an imaginative canvas, and at how his work has been nurtured by European theaters and festivals. I will argue that Lepage's relationship to Europe in his work has evolved from that of a distant, idealized, and I might even say culturally subservient position towards a more complex, critical, and reciprocal relationship with Europe. And just a very brief caveat as regards terms, I'm very aware that I'm using the word Europe in very broad terms. Just what constitutes Europe, who's in, who's out, are issues that are very hot and up to the present day. And I'm very aware, speaking in Thessaloniki, which has truly so historically been a frontier between Europe and the East, that we can't be casual about how we talk about Europe ever. So I'm going to say that when I first start talking about Lepage's relationship to Europe, I'm talking about the traditional European nations that are the base cultures of Quebec and Canada. That would be France and England. Now, that being said, even in the first production that I'm going to discuss, Lepage played with that assumption in a very interesting way. That production was Vinci, or Vinci, which was his first solo show created in 1986, which helped make his name as one of the most exciting forces in Quebec theatre, and this despite the fact that he was only at the time in his mid-20s. The production told the story of a young Quebec filmmaker called Philippe, one of many characters in Lepage's work who are quite openly identified as stand-ins for himself, for Lepage, who goes on a trip to Europe to recover from a personal trauma. The young artist's belief in himself and in the power of art is rekindled through a series of iconic encounters, most notably with the Mona Lisa in a Paris Burger King, and with Leonardo da Vinci in a Florence bathhouse. Philippe's relationship to Europe in the production was at a surface level touristic. He was a visitor. But to the Quebecois critic Jean Beauvais, his journey had significant cultural resonances in that it traced a backwards path through Quebec's source cultures. Philippe went first to England, the dominant colonial power in Quebec. He then went to France, the country which Francophone Quebec considers its cultural homeland. And then he went on, interestingly, to Italy, the birthplace of the Renaissance and of Western humanist thought, which is, Jean Beauvais implies, the basis of Quebecois culture.
Robert Lepage's work is a little like that Zen garden. No matter where you move to see it, some part of it always seems to be somewhere else in the world, somewhere out of view. Perhaps the only person who can lay claim to having seen all of Lepage's creative work is Lepage himself. Even his most devoted followers have never, can never see it all, no matter how traveled, no matter how determined they are. That is to say that as a Canadian theater critic and scholar with genuine interest in this master Canadian director's work, I haven't seen any more of that oeuvre than you have, living in Greece or Japan or other parts of Asia or even Jamaica. I might, in fact, as a Canadian, have seen less of his work. Which is to say that my ability to speak about Lepage as a Canadian probably only makes slightly more sense than inviting someone to speak of his work who comes from France or England or perhaps even Sweden. Which is also to say that Lepage may be from Canada, but he is to the Canadian theatrical experience what someone like Jerzy Grotowski has been to Poland, a brilliant a brilliantly creative magpie who finds his theatrical nourishment in many sources, some which happen to be around him, and many others which happen to strike his creative mind as he wanders Ulysses-like around the world, as Karen Fricker was just saying. But that said, I have seen a fair amount of Lepage's work in Toronto. One of his many financial backers has been the Du Maurier World Festival in Toronto. And that festival has brought in some of his most spectacular productions. Needles and Opium, his piece about jazz, love, and drugs. The Far Side of the Moon, which to me is about spacewalks and washing machines. 7 Streams of the River Ota, one early version of what may be Lepage's major opus about chance, love, catastrophe. And Elsinore, his one-man computer-assisted take on Hamlet. Early on, other Lepage productions passed through Toronto, including Polygraph, the Dragon Trilogy, and Tectonic Plates. Early experiments in form, structure, and the possibilities of privileging image over text. Over the years, Lepage's image theater has evolved into images and illusions out of the computer. And certainly the computer, our version of the ancient Greek theatrical machine, has become one of Lepage's major creative centers. His company in Quebec City is actually called Ex Machina. For the Greeks, as you well know, the machine was at the very heart of theatrical creation. It was a way to bring audiences personifications of the forces that moved their cosmology, a way, therefore, to confront those contemporary forces. As essential as they were to the final vision, they were not used casually, these ancient Greek machines. They were used only when they could help make a statement greater than a living actor could in Mask and Cathernae. When things became theatrically impossible on the stage, imagine that one-man Hamlet in which a game of cards is played between 2 actors who both appear simultaneously. Imagine the powerful forces 2,500 years ago bearing down on Medea, who has killed her own children, and she needs to escape her fate. Imagine those moments. Both cases, we can imagine impossible situations in which breathtaking images emerge from the machinery to save our protagonists and to give theatrical credibility to the whole. This, as you know, was the ancient Deus ex machina, the ancient God out of the machine. And it is to this modern Deus ex machina and this ancient sense of theatrical astonishment that so many of Lepage's coups de théâtre owe their genesis. In this sense, his work looks 2 ways at once: back to the most ancient forms of doer and viewer through enlarging structures, and forward to the growing number of theatrical events that exist in cyberspace today. From holographic performances to site-specific events created in multiple locations that can only be witnessed in their entirety via computers that can actually influence the imitated actions. Has Aristotle wept yet? But there are other major influences on Lepage to be spoken about as well. None of them, I might add, particularly Canadian. For me, the influence of the English homme de théâtre, Edward Gordon Craig, is clearest. Craig called for a controlling vision in the theater, an Uber-director, if you will, who could serve as artistic commander-in-chief, as visual visionary cum designer, as the supreme being of creation, and even, if possible, as the leading or only actor. All these elements are clearly part of Lepage's still growing arsenal. Craig wanted a theatrical event that was controllable, that could be calculated and repeated. If Lepage has not always been able to calculate as perfectly as he wanted to in his work, he certainly comes closer than Craig ever did in his career. Craig wanted the theater to be an event full of magic rather than an exploration of psychological realism. One critic early on in Craig's directorial career suggested that Craig was not so much interested in recreating the reality of the thing itself on a stage as he was in creating the impression of a thing. As he himself put it later, not a fight, but the heat of a fight. Not a kiss, but the magic of a kiss. And this is surely Lepage as well. The Canadian scholar Len Doucette has suggested that Lepage is most concerned as a director with light, space, and perspective. These were certainly Craig's obsessions as well. I could go on, but for lack of time here, let me conclude with a few remarks that are actually related to Lepage and Canada. Some time back, Lepage said in an interview in Toronto that when he works in Canada, that is to say English Canada, he is seen as primarily a Quebec artist. And he is comfortable with that since the base for his Ex Machina theater company is Quebec, and his support has come heavily from Quebec. He went on to say, however, that it was only when he worked outside of Canada that the Quebec tag disappeared, and he was then referred to as a Canadian director, a Canadian artist. What is it that happened outside the land of his birth to change him from a Quebecer to a Canadian? Without getting into a complicated and contentious subject, let me simply say that in Canada there are two realities, a Francophone reality and an Anglophone reality, and rarely do these realities meet. One Canadian novelist, Hugh MacLennan, referred to this relationship as two solitudes many decades back. And it has been, and I think still is, an accurate description of this odd socio-political and cultural reality. That is to say, very few in the country have been willing to cross the linguistic divide. To do so, of course, one needs to be comfortable in both languages, and one needs to understand both cultures. Robert Lepage has been one of the very few in the Canadian world of theater willing to risk that crossing. Indeed, Lepage is one of the very few artists working in Canada today with a genuine interest in trying to bridge the cultural solitudes by working in both French and English, and by ensuring that his work is seen by audiences in both Canadian cultures. As fluent in English as he is in French, and as celebrated in English Canada almost as much as he is in Quebec, Lepage is not only producer and actor and director and master of theater's magic machines on the stage, but he is also a Quebecer and a Canadian, a Francophone and an Anglophone, and that has been very much appreciated by English Canadian audiences. That is no mean feat. To do all that in a bifurcated Canada really does require one to be a magician, to at least appear godlike in vision and approach. I think what ultimately saves Robert Lepage from a severe case of terminal hubris at home is his humanity, his ability to understand both mundane reality and surreality, his ability to take us through the door of a modern everyman's washing machine into outer space, from quotidian realities to the spectacle of floating in the void. Let me end by saying I have no idea how Robert Lepage does all this, and at some level, I don't really want to know. I do want him to continue to be the magician he is, to keep cranking the gods out of his extraordinary machines, to bring the wondrousness of the ancient Deus Ex Machina to our own time, to keep me as audience catching my breath over and over again in awe of this master's kaleidoscopic visions and the many revisions his magical, mystical mind is clearly heir to. Thank you very much.